Okay, back again for um, evaluation of Sayyid Qutb. We talked about Sayyid Qutb in our previous lecture, and now I'm going to give some perspective on it. I want to begin first with the problem of Islam and modernity. Um, there are several factors in the relationship between Muslims and the modern world that need to be understood to see the context and the kind of things that Qutb and other Islamists are responding to. Um, so um, I would start with what you could call the decline of Islamic civilization. Um, in early Islam, um, Islam spread very rapidly. I mean, astonishingly uh, rapidly across a big portion of the world, conquest after conquest. Um, and this resulted in an expectation that Muslim community would always win, that Islam was supposed to go from victory to victory until the whole world was Islamic, right? And along with this came um, a kind of, maybe in a negative sense, triumphalism, um, but also a tendency to, if things went wrong, to think that this is disastrous, this is bad. Um, Islam developed several, Muslims developed several empires around the world. I won't run through them all. Um, the last one is probably best known to you, the Ottoman Empire. Um, but probably the golden age of Islamic civilization, I mean, fully developed civilization in terms of, art, architecture, learning, science, etc., was in Baghdad, where, familiar with that from Iraq now. It wasn't called Iraq then, of course. That's a modern nation state. Um, but the center, Baghdad, was the sort of center of the Muslim world. It's where the caliph, the recognized caliph, was, um, and which Muslims around the world would pay homage to or respect as sort of a higher authority. Didn't necessarily follow everything he said, but he had this special status. Um, and there was in Baghdad there was this institution called the House of Wisdom, which collected um, lots of books of great learning, and lots of intellectuals would come there to study, and so forth. And um, and arguably this was the sort of center of the intellectual world, just in general at the time, not just in the Muslim world. Um, then a shocking event happened in 1258. The Mongols had been marauding around, um, you know, conquering, wrecking destruction everywhere they went. Uh, and they decided to attack Baghdad. And they, as they sometimes did, they offered surrender, unconditional surrender before attacking. Um, and they ended up the leader the of Baghdad came out to them to negotiate, and they killed him, killed all the men who came with them, and then sacked the city. Um, just a horrible slaughter. I mean, pretty much destroyed the whole population. Uh, you know, um, the only survivors were people who were able to hide away and not be discovered. It was just so. This was the golden age of Islam, and the destruction of Baghdad was quite significant there. But it just sort of turned the center of power to other places. The real turning point where the Muslim where the Muslim states started losing ground to the West, or started obviously losing ground. It was declining in some ways, but it started to become obvious by 1683 is a pivotal year when Ottomans sieged Vienna. They had done it before unsuccessfully, and they were launching another siege on Vienna, which you're talking about in the heart of Europe. I mean, so Islam has been spreading, pushing, um, worrying a lot of Europeans, right? And this is pretty late. This is 1683. Um, in the scheme of things, but they were beaten. They were routed at the second siege, and it was revealed just the superiority of Western military means. And then the Ottomans, which was the great empire at the time, Muslim empire, just went from defeat to defeat. It's sort of the opposite of the way it was at the beginning, where they went from victory to victory. Seemed like they couldn't lose. Now it was defeat to defeat. It seemed like they couldn't win, and just the military superiority of Western nations became apparent. And then other areas became more and more apparent. The West was advancing scientifically. It was advancing economically, etc. And the Muslim world was falling behind, to the point where by the 19th century, Turkey, which where the Ottoman Empire was based, modern day Turkey, Asia Minor, became known as the sick man of Europe. It was just it was it was universally seen as a weak state that you know was, if anything, dragging Europe down, um, and so it was just obvious to everyone that that this once great Muslim power was in a state of deep decline. Then you had imperial in the 19th century. The waves of Western imperialism, where imperial powers, the British Empire, the French, et cetera, et cetera, were all conquering various regions of the world, including the Muslim regions, right? And you remember Syed Qutb came up in this context in Egypt. The British were in charge, the British Empire, and and so there's a pervasive sense around the Muslim world that the Muslim world in general is in a state of decline, and and they're being now totally dominated by the West, and a great deal of resentment is being felt towards these Western imperial powers. And then after World War II, you got the final destruction of the caliphate. There had been continuously a caliph from the time of Muhammad all the way until the end of World War One. But at the end of World War One, in the Sykes-Picot Treaty, they carved up the Ottoman Empire, left basically Turkey with the Ottoman Empire as Turkey. All the rest of it was sort of divided up, among the great powers. Um, and then just a few years later, Mustafa Kemal, better known in the West as Ataturk, uh, he and the parliament and that was standing in Turkey, the Republic of Turkey, it was now called, um, abolished the caliphate. So the caliphate was no more. And this is something that some jihadists have pointed to as a great crime. Um, they don't typically emphasize Ataturk's role, or the the Turkish parliament, but they'll mention Sykes-Picot. You'll see that name come up sometimes in jihadist literature. Bin Laden, as you'll see later, didn't mention Sykes-Picot, I think, but he did say that the caliphate has not existed for X number of years, and that takes you back to this time. Okay, so so that's just a general rundown of Muslim history in the background, and um, and so how did Muslims respond to this? Well, in terms of Muslim attitudes towards decline, there were basically three um, options. One was that the fault lies with outsiders. It's the West, Western imperialism, it's the Jews. Sometimes that was become anti-Semitism had it wasn't always intense in the Islamic world as it was in Christian Europe, for example. But in World War II, the Grand Mufti in Egypt had allied himself with the Nazis and had endorsed their ideology, and the Nazi anti-Semitism was embraced by a leading nation of the Muslim world, and this became a thing, a major part of the attitudes, and the Jews were, as they have been in Western history, scapegoats, conspiracy theories of Jews who are behind the scenes or whatever. In fact, Israel is often talked about in the jihadist literature as basically an outpost of the West. It's and and the Iranians would call Israel the little Satan, and the United States the great Satan, because it was, we were the power behind the throne. We were essentially propping up this nation that would otherwise not be able to sustain itself against the surrounding Muslim powers and so forth. So you blame it on outsiders. That's one approach. You could blame it on yourself. Another approach for either failing to adapt to Western ways or failing to modernize or neglecting the faith, because we've strayed from Islam, from the true faith, and that's why we're not doing bad. Or you could have some combination of these things, of one and two, right? Partly the fault of outsiders, partly our fault, and so these were the kinds of options that Muslims were wrestling with in the 20th century to try to, have come up to some kind of positive view of themselves and their place in the modern world, right? If you focus specifically on modernity and modernization, there were various attitudes towards that. I would single out, I think, three covers the spectrum. One response was attraction, enthusiastic modernization. People just like, the key is we need to modernize. We're behind the times. We need to, go whole hog modernize. A second response was revulsion. Saw modernization as destroying cherished traditions, turning people away from Islam through westernization, secularization, corruption, decadence, that kind of thing. And then a third response was ambivalence. This may be the most common. We want to modernize, but maybe we don't want to westernize. And are those things separable? I mean, is modern, because modernization was a product of Western civilization. Do you have to have Western values and outlook to modernize, or are they separable? Right? Can we modernize also and keep our own traditions? Right? Can we modernize and Islamize? And a lot of people like Qutb wanted to do this. Like, we should take all their technology and stuff like that. We should modernize in that technical sense, but we should Islamize in terms of our values when we look at the world. Um, so these were the attitudes towards modernity. Now, in terms of Qutb's critique of modernity, um, I would say it's not entirely wrong. I mean, think about Eric Voegelin's uh, um, critique of modernity, right? We've kept looking at Vogelin as to help us interpret these ideological movements. And so Vogelin thought there's serious crisis of modernity, and he interpreted it not entirely differently from Qutb as fundamentally a spiritual crisis, right? Vogelin talked about it as a loss of spiritual substance, right? Substantive uh, spiritual life um, that would uh, give rise to healthy personal and political order, right? Um, and then Vogelin had said, well, uh, the, the concomitants of this um, in terms of ideologies were an immanentization of Christianity, right? Making secularizing it, putting it in a this worldly form. Um, there were what he called elsewhere misplacements of the ground of being, the ground of human existence, in something else, right? Whether it was in some kind of racial purity or, um, getting the right economic system or whatever it was. They put their identity, the basis of their existence, in this thing rather than in divine transcendent reality. And correspondingly, they created what Vogelin calls, uh, in his book Hitler and the Germans, second realities. Right. This technically it's ideologies in terms of the the ideas and the vision of the world, the worldview. He called these second realities. They didn't correspond with the first reality, the actual reality. Um, they imposed the second reality on the world, and this is what caused so much destruction. In other words, Vogelin thought there was indeed a vacuum of meaning in the modern world, and it was being filled by substitutes for spiritual substance that would inevitably fail to satisfy. Right? So in all that, he's not, at least on the conceptual level, he's not far off Qutb. Um, he just has different ideas about what really is the source of meaning and how we understand this relation to transcendence and so forth. Um, but I would say, in terms of the crisis of modernity, I think the larger context for jihadism is, I'm sorry, there's more pipe cutting in the background. Try to speak up. Um, the context for jihadism, in the larger sense, is the overlap between the decline of Islam and the decline of the West. You have two civilizations declining. I mean, in the Muslim case, there were multiple civilizations, you could say, but all united by this common um, foundational um, factor of religion of Islam. It's in the context. So these the people in the context of the decline of Muslim civilization are also living in the context of the decline of Western civilization, which is forced itself upon them through imperialism, right, and through mass media increasingly. Um, and then, so, we brought up Vogelin. Consider Qutb's ideology here in terms of a political religion. Um, could we see Qutb's ideologized version of Islam, Islam as ideology of this particular sort, can we see this as just another failed substitute for the spiritual substance that um, people might argue were the foundation for these civilizations, right? Um, so consider the some key elements here for Qutb. There goes the pipes again. Hope you can hear me. First of all, there was disorientation, right? I mean, Qutb himself shared in the general disorientation of Muslims felt in the modern context, right? I mean, in this context of modernization where traditions were being uprooted and Western powers were dominating, it's people's sense of identity, people's sense of how to understand their place in the world. It's a lot of dislocation, a lot of disorientation, and that was widespread. But then you could talk about his own personal disorientation. He tried out various systems. I mean, he flirted around with socialism. He flirted around with various Western ideas, and then he had a personal crisis during his trip to Americas. Apparently, on the boat ride over, he had a sort of defining moment where he was struggling with himself. Am I going to go with Islam, or am I going to go with sort of more Western approaches? See, there was still some ambivalence within him, and that's when he decisively said it's going to be Islam, right, as he understood it. And there were frustrated expectations at failed efforts for dramatic change. I mean, when he came back, joined the Muslim Brotherhood, supported Nasser, who seemed to be supporting them, right, and then was let down on that. And then, of course, there were the arrests and the torture and everything else. And his prison experience, this caused a lot of personal disorientation. So this is sort of the immediate context of his development of the system, and that's what I mean. He tries to escape, find salvation through this system, right? That answer all questions and solve all problems, right? So, what about this system? Okay, so in terms of ideology, there was a utopia of a sort, right? There was the golden age of Islam, this idealized, you know, first generations of Islam when people did it right, right? And we just need to go back. We just need to recover in our own times and maybe a new, sort of manifestations according to circumstances, but in terms of their fundamental way of life, we'll recapture it in this time, right? And then in terms of the ideology, he's engaging in a radical simplification of both of the world and of Islam, right? In terms of the world, it's Islam versus Jahiliyyah. I mean, that's it. There's no gray areas, right? There's no gray area about what Islam is. There's no gray area about what the Jahiliyyah is, and so there's this Manichaean view. There's good and evil, right? And nothing in between. So that's radical simplification of the world. And then this radical simplification of Islam consists of three concepts, really. Tawheed, the oneness of God, understood as not allowing for any other kind of sovereignty, and that's the second. That's the second concept. Hakimiyya, sovereignty, right? Which that makes it simple because all the systems of the world are wrong. You just have to apply Sharia, and that's the right system, right? And that will reestablish essentially the caliphate, khilafah, this vice regency, this acting as a deputy of God, right? I mean, if you deputize someone, sheriff, right? You're saying, okay, I need you to do these things, right? You're not gonna, you're not gonna just do whatever you want to do. You're going to, help the sheriff do what he deputized you to do, right? And that's the idea of Muslims and Muslim leadership. We're going to live by this principle of Tawheed, recognizing God's Hakamiyah, sovereignty, um, and acting as Khilafah, regents or deputies of God. Simple. It's nice, clear, clean. Um, don't complicate it by a lot of you know needless irrational reflection. Um, and then there's a simple method, the manhaj, uh, simple method of just reading the Quran, which is crystal clear. You know, there's no real room for debate about what it means, and straightforwardly applying it. That's the ideology is always a simplification of the world, but this is a radical simplification, right? And then revolution, this element of revolt against the world systems, but ultimately against reality itself. It seems, with its manifold imperfections, he cannot live with this imperfection in the world, and he uses in a signpost phrases like we need to cleanse the earth of all these corruptions, right? And then finally, there's a kind of Qutb adopts a kind of saving leader, right? A new leader with a capital L who will sort of lead them into the promised land, and that seems to be Qutb himself. I mean, it's not the way he presents it, but right, he is the vanguard of the vanguard. He is the one who's directing the vanguard who will reestablish the Ummah, and the caliphate, and so forth. He is the one who is pointing out the signpost. He is the one who is leading the way. He is a kind of Christ figure, right? Much as it would have shocked him to have that suggestion made to him. So in all of this, I think we're, I think hopefully that helps to think about the nature of the ideology involved here, how it serves as an ideology, and I brought some things that Michael Frieden has suggested to help with this. The simplification aspect is something he stressed, and some of Vogelin's suggestions. But that's my take. Okay, I'll stop there on Qutb, and then next up will be Ayatollah Khomeini, the Shiite leader. Qutb again was Sunni, but the greatest of the revolutionary Shiites was Ayatollah Khomeini. So he's up next. See you then.